Welcome everyone to the third Humanities Now conversation of the fall semester. I hope everybody's having a good semester and things aren't too stressful as things are winding down for everyone. So I'm keeping things pretty light and informal. Our topic might not be, but in terms of the structure of these conversations. And so I'll just give a really brief introduction of Dr. Schroeder, and then it's open to him giving us some comments, and then we'll have discussion. So again, you can raise your hand and ask a question. You can ask it in the chat if that feels more comfortable to you. But we hope that this is going to be a robust conversation. So my really brief introduction for Dr. Schroeder is that he is the chair and a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy, and he kindly agreed to speak to us today about the ethics of the pandemic, something that I think is probably foremost on the minds of a lot of us, given our current situation. And so without further ado, Dr. Schroeder.
Thank you very much. It's really fun to have this opportunity. I hope that you will enjoy spending some of your lunchtime thinking about this stuff and chatting with me. I don't have a very structured formal presentation, and that's partly because I think that we're all pretty much acquainted with most of the important basic facts of the case, and because what I hope a philosopher who does some work in ethics has to contribute to this discussion isn't to tell you the answer, but to be a useful person to bounce your own thinking off of in order to hear how philosophers think your ideas can be improved and sharpened up so that you can really ask the questions that you want to ask or really reach the conclusions that make the most sense to you. I am here not because the philosophy of epidemiology is my major research focus. There is a South African philosopher whose principal topic is that, and that philosopher weighed in early on in the philosophical community with some really deep and interesting thoughts. Uh, uh, but but I do a little bit of work in moral philosophy. But there, most of my work is in what sometimes gets called moral psychology, which is something like our psychological relationship to morality. Where do our motivations come from, and especially our motivations that matter morally? Which motivations matter morally and why? What's the intersection of our understanding of the world and our emotions and our desires? What's that look like? What's the nature of virtue and vice? Stuff like that. So I'm not really any kind of expert within my field on what's right or wrong, but I, like lots of philosophers, have some familiarity with what's going on. And that's why last summer, when the pandemic was in full force, I taught a summer course on the ethics of the pandemic. And it was really exciting as an opportunity to just think through what philosophers have already done in moral and political theory, in moral psychology, in uh, straight up questions of right and wrong, in questions about how medical professionals should conduct themselves in general, and then applying that to the facts of the pandemic, applying them to the facts as they stood in the summer. The facts today stand a little differently, of course, but a lot of the facts broadly are very similar. We have a little bit more confidence in some of what we think about how the coronavirus is spread and what its consequences are. Some of those consequences have just changed. Medical professionals have learned to take better care of people who are sick with COVID. Um, and that has changed facts about what it becomes reasonable to do and what risks are presented to us and so on, without fundamentally changing anything. But that nothing fundamentally has changed doesn't mean it doesn't matter to the people whose lives have been saved because we know better how to treat them. Of course, it matters a lot. So we have some new facts, some old facts, and they're an opportunity to work through what we should do and how we should feel about what other people are doing. and to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Let me just give you a little sampler plate of the kinds of things that students found really interesting over the summer and that you might find interesting too. So, one of them is to ask really personal ground level questions like, am I doing the right thing by ordering grocery delivery? Like, on the one hand, that means I don't increase my infection risk. That seems good for me, and it seems good for the people that I have direct responsibility for in my household, my spouse, and my young son. Um, it seems good epidemiologically to reduce the number of people who are out and about in general. The fewer people out and about, the better. But it also seems quite concerning because it means that I'm asking somebody else to take the risk. And epidemiologically, uh, 5 people taking all of the risk so that you know 1 million people don't have to take any risk is great. But you sure hope those 5 people are okay with it because it doesn't sound very nice for them. Um, and of course, we know that uh, that people who are buying groceries and delivering them are mostly people who don't have a lot of financial choices and who would themselves be really happy if they didn't have to accept uh, any more risk than I accept for the pandemic. Um, so, am I being selfish? Am I regrettably stuck with making decisions that are imperfect but are better than the alternatives, all things considered? Uh, Is it okay to just think about society-wide risk and reward? Is it necessary to think about whether, uh, even though society as a whole is better off, it is better off by unjustly exploiting people, and therefore it's wrong, and society just has to accept being a little worse off to not be so exploitative? That's a whole set of questions that people found really interesting. Another set of questions that people found really interesting was how to think about our own emotional reactions to others and to ourselves and to the facts of the situation. Uh, so, for instance, uh, we had uh, a discussion about uh, who you can be mad at for the facts that we're living through, who you can be mad at that uh, uh, well over 230,000 Americans have been killed by the pandemic directly or indirectly through like not getting, uh, seeking or getting access to healthcare that they need for other conditions as well. Uh, you can say, how should I just feel about all of this death? Is my feeling that I would literally risk my life to be able to eat a hamburger with my friends in peace and not think about the epidemic for a day? Is that an unreasonable, childish, selfish feeling? Is that a perfectly reasonable, responsible adult feeling? Do feelings merit evaluation on dimensions like childish and adult or reasonable and unreasonable? That was a whole set of discussions. And then, especially, you might think, is it justified for me to be angry at the governor of Texas? Whether the governor makes right or wrong decisions, that's one question, or say decisions that bring about good or bad results. But if the governor is trying to do what's best as far as the governor understands it, does that mean that I can't really be angry even if I uh, accept that uh, uh, worse things have happened under certain decisions than could have happened under other decisions? For example, what about uh, how I should feel about the presidency, how Donald Trump has chosen to respond to the pandemic? Uh, has he attempted to do what he saw was best? And if he did, is that uh, an excuse that any reasonable person has to take seriously? And if not, why not? And if so, why so? And then finally, something else that people got really excited about is the question about what is the legitimate role of a government in a pandemic in general? And it's a kind of a question that we've seen in all kinds of contexts. A really simple example might be it's kind of a version of the question of what is the government's role in making people wear seatbelts, or what is the government's role in uh, in regulating what kind of food can be bought and sold and the production conditions of that food. So on the one hand, it seems like it would be nice if uh, we collectively, in the person of our government, didn't tell each other what to do in general. uh, it would be nice. Like, you want to make some bread and sell it to somebody. Why don't you just go ahead and make some bread and sell it to somebody? Uh, and but then, of course, we recognize, well, sometimes we want the government to tell each other what to do. Like, don't do things that are going to hurt me. So, uh, if you want to drive really fast, don't do it on a public road, do it on a racetrack, or if you really have to, on a private road that you rent, or maybe that you own if you live in the countryside and you have things like that. Go knock yourself out, but don't do it around me. But then even there, we might think, well, but everything that people does affects other people at least a bit. uh, if you crash your car driving crazily fast on a private road, that might result in you getting airlifted somewhere. And then maybe I won't have an airlift to the hospital when I need it, even though what I was doing was being perfectly reasonable and responsible. Everything that we do affects other people somehow. At least there's a statistically meaningful chance of it affecting other people somehow. We don't really think that it's okay for the government to then intervene in every life choice, regardless. So, what are the principles that balance when the government should stick its nose in and when not? The governor of South Dakota has been widely quoted as saying that its goal during the pandemic has been to inform its citizens of the facts and let them make their own choices uh, as they see fit under good information. And if they choose to wear masks to reduce the risk to themselves and others, then that's good. If they feel on balance that that is not the choice for them, then that's good too. And the governor has stated that she's not interested in using any of the power of her office to make people do otherwise than to make their decisions in full information. That's obviously not what a lot of other governors have decided to do. Right now, South Dakota is seeing a huge number of coronavirus cases. The spread of the disease is so fast that they don't have meaningful ability to test how many people are sick anymore. The positivity rate the last time I saw was just a smidge over 50% positive. Maybe it was 40. It was just, but some insanely high figure. It was basically, I think it was 50.2 the last time I saw a number, um, meaning that half of everybody who gets tested is sick, meaning they have no clue really how many people are tested, um, how many people are sick. Uh, yeah, I'm sure everybody here has heard the suggestion from epidemiologists that if you really want to know how many people in your community are sick, you need to test so many people that only 5% of your tests are returning positive, and maybe more like 1% if you want to have a really sound idea of how many people in your community are sick. Even then, you still won't really know, but you will have a meaningful basis for saying, we have an idea, because you're testing so widely that you're pretty confident that you're picking up excellent information about the cases. When 50% of the people you test are sick, there's a lot of people that you're not testing who are sick. And it becomes very hard to even guess how many. However, those people are all enjoying the ability to run their lives during the pandemic as they see fit without a centralized authority telling them not to do things that they want to do. certainly it's true that they're a lot sicker, and some people are dying who wouldn't otherwise die, but they are also free of a lot of restraints that other people live under. And we had a really good time discussing what the basis is for governments having the right to impose any restraint at all, and whether the considerations that allow governments to impose some restraints apply or don't apply, especially in the case of the coronavirus. So, three different topics that we talked about: how we should feel about ourselves and one another, the rights and roles of the government, and the tricky interpersonal one on one choices that we make as individuals, just we, meaning like you and me, those of us sitting here today. Um, and I'm open to talk about anything else, but I found those two discussions especially exciting and interesting. And I just want to hear from you. Um, Faye, can you suggest for us how should we do a discussion period? I really kind of said what I want to say by way of setting up a discussion, and now I just want to talk.
Okay, great. Well, people also want to talk to you because the chat is filling up with questions. So I think we should just take them in order. Um, so I'll take first Matthew Eunice's question. Would you argue that people generally have intrinsic motivation to do the best thing for society rather than themselves?
Matthew, thank you for the question. Awesome question. This is something that I work on a lot as a theorist and read a lot of other people's work on. And I think the answer is something like this. Just the way you asked it, the answer is yes, people do have an intrinsic motivation to do what's best for other people. And the reason for saying that is something like this: that people who don't have any motivation to do what's good for other people, who really don't, who aren't emotionally or behaviorally moved one drop by somebody else suffering or dying, those people are called psychopaths or sociopaths, depending on how you like to talk about it. They're a very small percentage of the human population. It's a very unusual outlier condition. Those of us who are not psychopaths, everybody in this chat for sure, almost for sure, but I'm pretty confident. Um, we all care if you could end world hunger at the cost of not having another meal today magically somehow. You'd do it. You'd suffer through that. Even if you don't consider yourself a particularly generous person, you'd be like, but come on, world hunger. Sure, I'll do that. Um, However, what you didn't ask, Matthew, in the exact way you phrased your question, but which I suspect you're thinking, is not only do we have an intrinsic motivation to do what's good for society, but is it very strong? Like, are we highly motivated, so highly that we would sacrifice a lot if we understood that it was best for society? And here I think the answer is obviously it varies person to person. And for most of us, and I'm not going to exclude myself here, I don't think the motivation is all that strong. You know, the uh, the motivation to do good for others is real. The motivation to uh, drink a really delicious cup of coffee is real, and they come in conflict all the time. I know that all of us are well aware that there are organizations that would take our coffee budget for the week. If you're a coffee drinker, tea drinker, wine drinker, if you only drink tap water, maybe you're already doing what I'm envisioning and about to talk about. But most of us, we have a budget for drinking nice things that are totally optional in our lives. And we all know that we could take that money and send it to Oxfam or Deworm the World, or people who make sure that people who are subject to malaria have bed nets or something. And we would, if we were thoughtful about where we sent the money, save somebody's life, or maybe save half a person's life, meaning make a contribution that if somebody else matches it, can statistically be expected to save a life. But all of us, including me, take at least some of the money that we could be doing that with and spend it on coffee or wine or beer or, you know, other stuff that's really optional. It's not just because we don't know where to send the money. Like, you know, if you were really motivated to do what was good for the world, but you just weren't sure, you wouldn't be like, well, I'm not sure. So I think I'll just spend the next 40 years of my life buying nice consumer goods and coffee and not, you know, send the money anywhere else. But that is how we mostly live. Uh, so obviously, our motivation to do good for others, just in the most abstract terms, is not that strong. But some people argue that it's stronger than it has been, and that part of the way that it gets stronger is when we just know more about people around the world, when we see more faces of people who are strangers to us and hear more about their lives, read novels about them or watch TV shows about them that present them in a sympathetic light and help us understand how those people are enough like us that even in spite of their differences, we care about them. We feel their pain empathically and wish that they didn't have it. And stuff like that really helps us expand our circle of concern and our depth of concern. So I think we do have the broad motivation, but it's not super strong. But it's not that we're like that opposed to it. It's just that, you know, it's kind of in between. It needs some help. And you might say that's one of the reasons that we form uh, governments that is other interested. It's like, well, it's good for us to live under an organized government, but also organized governments help us do things that we wish we could do for others, but that we're not going to get our act together to do on our own. And it partly just makes it a lot easier, a lot cheaper. You can take care of a lot more people if you have a well-organized government that uses taxation to take care of people. If you have to do all of that all on your own without taxation, it is a lot harder. You can't invest in resources. You can't invest in economies of scale. You can't target programs where they're most needed because you don't know, because you don't have the information gathering resources, you know, all of that stuff. But but as we know, people aren't that keen for their governments to be that good. They want them to be like not too terrible, but like not super nice. And that shows also again our limits of how much we're motivated to take care of others.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump on to Raul if
Oh, yeah.
I can. Is it wrong to look down on others who meet with others in unsafe conditions during the pandemic? I do not think it is wrong, but I would advise a certain amount of humility. So it's something like this. Uh, uh, I definitely hold people in a certain contempt when they are just recklessly getting themselves and others sick. Uh, and you know they know that they're not well protected, and they know that uh, uh, the risks are real, and they're just doing it anyway. And it's often people who are mostly thinking in these terms. Well, even if I get sick, I won't get that sick. So, you know, what's the big deal? They normally, I think people normally don't think, yeah, but if I get uh, one of my friends sick who has an elderly grandmother who depends on that friend, or a friend of a friend, then I'm going to get the elderly grandmother sick and she might die, unlike me, who has an excellent chance of being just fine. And when people think like that, they're really thinking very selfishly. And I think we're all against extreme selfishness. And it's okay to feel you're being against extreme selfishness when you notice somebody being extremely selfish and think, what a selfish jerk. So that's right. But the humility that I would advise is to remember that we all have been selfish jerks. And even those of us who are being very unselfish and unjerky during the pandemic can find other occasions on which we have been selfish jerks. So the emotional reaction is totally reasonable and totally right, but it's good to balance it with remembering that you're not currently reacting to the really crummy thing that you did in that one romantic relationship out of very selfish emotions, or the thing that you do every day because you really just can't be bothered to do better, which also would deserve its own disapprobation. Uh, Arnav,
Yeah, chat is just filling up with more and more questions.
I will try to be a somewhat efficient conversationalist. Um, how has the lack of government intervention during the pandemic resulted in more widespread COVID? And how could government intervention or any other intervention be improved if it were to hypothetically occur again? These are great questions, but I'm going to have to say, as a philosopher, I have no expertise to answer these questions. This is really a scientific question. It's a scientific question that should be studied by an interdisciplinary group of people, including epidemiologists, but also including sociologists and anthropologists and social psychologists, because all of the stuff that governments can do relies on people reacting to what governments do. Uh, so we know that some stuff would have been better, like for instance, to uh, let epidemiologists and public health officials drive the public messaging, and for the federal government to consistently put a full weight of its visible support behind that messaging. That would have been better. Uh, you can compare the US to Canada, two highly comparable countries. Canada also hasn't done great with its pandemic, but it's done a lot better. And the main thing that it's done differently is to just consistently let public health experts drive the messaging of the government. The Canadian government really has fewer resources to deal with a pandemic than the US does because it's a lot smaller. And because your scientists are honestly, on average, well, the top end of your scientists really are the cream of the crop of the entire planet, are almost all of the best people in the world. In almost every field where there are top people work in the United States. It's just like an overabundance of riches. You have so much expertise and so much wealth for dealing with this problem. And Canada still kicked your butt. I'm a Canadian. So, in one sense, I'm proud. But in another sense, I feel very alarmed and ashamed. Like something has gone terribly wrong in the country of my green card's permanent residency. And, gee, I wish it had gone differently. But like, what specifically, beyond the most trivial stuff to say, could have been done differently? I don't have the expertise to say. Um, and I could point you to people that I think have a lot of expertise, uh, in addition to the people that you've become accustomed to seeing and discussed on the national news. I'll mention that I found a lot of valuable stuff coming from the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Prevention at the University of Minnesota. Michael Osterholm is the director of that center. And he's had a lot of experience, and he has been a somewhat independent voice. He's not, strongly attached to the CDC or other large governmental organizations. He has a lot of public health experience. He's done a lot of popular discussion for regular people like us who are not experts. So, you could add to your list of readings, but your view and mine are both comparably good, I think, because we're not experts in public health policy. But we know that it could have gone a lot better because we have the example of even Canada, which is a pretty good example.
Can I ask
From,
a
oh, yes,
yeah,
Faye's got a
just
follow-up.
you mentioned that it would be good to have a group of people of different kind in different, sociologists, um, philosophers, ethicists. I'm just curious, it made me wonder, are you aware of that happening where governments do convene that kind of wide array of expertise as they're making these decisions. And I'm going to ask in a really selfish way because this is a humanities conversation. I'm just struck by your point that there should be humanities centered people a part of these conversations that I think many folks tend to assume is only going to be driven by hard sciences. And so I was just curious if you knew of cases where that is how they're doing their decision making, is convening a wide array of people.
I don't know about concrete instances, but I can certainly say um, that there's no shortage of large-scale interdisciplinary research projects in public health in the US or in Western Europe, for example. Um, and they tend to be like predominantly natural scientists and social scientists, but there are usually ethicists included in some fashion, often historians, um, people who do very humanistic anthropological work, who are sometimes in humanities schools and sometimes not, depending on the sort of the accidents of individual institutions. And all of those people play really important roles in talking about, like, why is it that people accept or resist policies? It's very hard to just measure from the height of abstraction that you see in sociology or social psychology even. um, it's important to sort of get down into thinking about um, uh, what really motivates people, and what speaks to people, and what kinds of people's reports of their own behavior are credibly insightful, and which ones sound like they're repeating talking points without really knowing um, their underlying motivational structure. And you know because you're wading into topics where uh, you can run out of evidence to conclusively answer questions, you often find that scientists don't have a lot of tolerance for even asking the question, or waiting, trying to think through what the issues are. Um, uh, the That's certainly not the way to approach your role as a scientist if you're trying to write a research grant that's going to get funded. You should ask questions you can answer. But it's certainly the role of humanists to ask questions that nobody has been able to answer for 2,500 years. But that doesn't mean that you're going to give up uh, questions about what's right and wrong, and about what the nature of motivation is, and stuff like that. And to ask more humbly questions about individual cases that theoretically you could get right or wrong, like why this group of people was so resistant to taking advice about vaccines. Um, but they just have ways of approaching those questions um, that uh, accept that they don't have the ability to, uh, guarantee empirically validatable answers, but because they're ready to get in and explore, they uh, can make it possible to come up with uh, hypotheses, with ways of understanding things that maybe can give you some direction to go forward. So if you have some idea that uh, some amount of self-deception about motivation is in play in certain populations, because you have an understanding of self-deception that's derived from reading a lot of literature, or from uh, talking like a humanist with other humanists, then uh, you can suggest that to the scientists and suggest what you think might be going on instead, and give them actual hypotheses. I don't think that I would recommend in general that, like, you set public health policy based on the hunch of a Freudian historian of medicine, but you absolutely should um, look for deeper and better explanations of why people react to government policy the way they do, in ways that help the government achieve health goals, or prevent the government from achieving health goals depending on how the government has acted and how it's framed, how it's acting, and how other actors are responding to the government's framing. Um, you need people who are smart about human beings to generate the hypotheses that are worth testing. You can't test every hypothesis. You need smart people in there, and that's um, the the first role that I would give to humanists outside of ethics, and then inside of ethics, I would add. It also gives you some ideas about what kinds of ways of achieving policy you just shouldn't do because, for instance, they involve unjustly exploiting a group of people that say you could pin all of the epidemiological burden on. It's like, oh, it's just like 6% of our population. You can just like stick all of them with getting sick and everybody else will be fine. Talking about why that's not a good idea unless those people are all gung-ho, well-informed volunteers is really, really important. All right. From Vipin, do I believe that we will ever find a balance between individuals acting on their own free will and centralized authority, regulating social behavior during a pandemic? And like, how much can people just choose for themselves? I think there are a couple of answers that I would like to say. One is that I think there is a legitimate range that people can choose from within, and that part of the point of a democracy is to choose within a legitimate range of options. I uh, I really think that doing nothing for public health is not a legitimate option. Um, uh, just like giving people some information and doing nothing when you're seeing the deaths run up is the same as, you know, seeing uh, deaths run up because of a really dangerous intersection in a city and not doing anything to improve the intersection. Like that's not acceptable behavior from a government. Like you gave them the power to set intersection rules so that people wouldn't die. Don't just like tell them, hey, by the way, this is a dangerous intersection. If people keep dying, you have to change the intersection. Maybe make it a four-way stop. Maybe put some lights on it. Maybe change the sight lines. Something. You can't just sit there and do nothing. The reason that we have a government is so that we don't have to wander through the world as individual hunters and gatherers of a modern era. It's so that we can cooperate. However, it's also true that people can reasonably accept different amounts of risk and see things as differently valuable. So, you know, some people do the kind of mountain climbing where it's not it's not too improbable that you'll be seriously injured or die doing that kind of climbing. Even more so for people who are excited about ice climbing. Ice climbing is really dangerous. Like those risks are appropriate for people who want to take them on, and they're not appropriate for people who don't want to take them on. But when we're talking about like shared risk, we can imagine, suppose that there was a society that was like 80% ice climbers. It would be okay for them to vote for accepting more risk in return for more opportunities to do things. And supposing that it was a society of chickens like me, then if like 80% of the people like me, it would be okay for us to vote for accepting less risk and having fewer options. So like, I think there's a range, but you know, but the range has to say something like, look, if a lot of people are going to die, like you have to do something. That's why we have a government in the first place. And you of course also have to say that you can't have us all collectively decide everything. I don't want all of my country of citizenship or my country of permanent residence to vote on what socks I should wear, even if they're willing to take the time. I really don't want that vote to be binding on me. So, like, okay, even if they could make a better decision, Tim, if we were in charge of your socks, you'd have thrown out the ones with holes by now. Okay, okay, yes, you would have made better decisions for me. But I'd rather that you just don't make them, right? and leave me on my own. So I think there's a legitimate range of balance points to be set and different balance points in different societies. But when it comes to a pandemic, the smallest society that you should take into account is something like a whole country, because a pandemic is just going to run through one country pretty much as a country. And you can set the best policies in the world in uh, Texas, and you won't get the outcomes that you earned through your policymaking if they set exactly the opposite policies in Louisiana and in New Mexico and Arizona and Oklahoma and Kansas. Now, as we know, in an era of flying, if they set exactly the opposite policies in Los Angeles and New York City. So that's like a kind of a wishy-washy answer, but I feel like it's important to recognize that that we collectively set some of our risk thresholds, that there isn't like an absolute right or wrong level to set them at, because they're like legitimately traded off against things that mean something to us. But there are limits to those ranges. Limits set, if by nothing else, by the very purpose for which we have bothered to have a government in the first place. India Bellamy asks, do you believe that even if we get a vaccine for this virus, that there will be a chance for life to go back to normal, or is wearing masks and things like that expected to be the new normal? This is, again, a question where I'm not competent to have anything like an expert opinion, but my gut is that we will go back to normal. Partly what will happen is that we'll have the disease sufficiently under control that we won't have to think about it too much. It'll be like the measles. There might sometimes be outbreaks, and they'll be very concerning when there are outbreaks, but mostly we'll have it under control. Maybe partly what will happen is that, like with some diseases, the disease itself will evolve variants that are less harmful and kill fewer people and disable fewer people will become more prevalent as they outcompete more harmful ones. And they'll outcompete them exactly because when more harmful variants spread, people try harder to lock them, to protect themselves, try harder to prevent the distribution of the virus. That often happens with infectious diseases. That happened with, I understand, according to an article I read, with the H1N1 flu, that it became less deadly over time, meaning versions of it that were less harmful survived human efforts to tamp down that flu. Variants that were more harmful because they caused worse consequences were more effectively tamped down. Now it's just like another flu in the mix. So I think we'll get back to something like normal. But honestly, don't come to Tim for your predictions about what's going to happen with a virus. Go to a virologist. Go to a public health historian. Don't go to the philosopher. Should we be mad at people who are just giving up fighting the pandemic? Come to the philosopher to ask that question. From Lauren Schwartz, do you think society will ever go back to normal? Sorry, same question. There you go. I'm happy that I answered two with one. Saksham, since everyone has a varying degree of motivation to do what's best for society, why do you think people are so reckless with their behavior if it's not safe for their own health? One of the things that we know is that people are told different things about how dangerous this virus is. And another thing that we know is that thinking about risks like these it's very hard. It's very hard for people in general to think about probabilities that are, less than 1 in 100. So like there's less than 1 in 100 chance that I would be killed if I would be exposed to the coronavirus and get it. just based on the basic facts about me. I'm overweight, but otherwise in perfectly okay health, uh, and I am just turning 50. So my odds of getting killed by it are not very high. But you know, 1 in 100 is a risk that I certainly wouldn't take with my life in most circumstances. Like, suppose you're trying to convince me uh, to to go bungee jumping at a specific location. I say, like, didn't somebody get killed there? And you say, like, oh yeah, like last year they had like 30,000 people come through, and 300 of them died. 1 in 100. Uh, But come on, like everybody else lived. I'm not gonna go bungee jumping at a place that kills 300 people a year. Uh, I'm not crazy. I'd take a 1 in 100 chance of dying to, give my son a second kidney if he needed it or something, because that's really important and worth it. But I'm not gonna just like frivolously take a 1 in 100 chance of dying. Um, it's when the numbers become even smaller, like 1 in 1,000, it really just becomes honestly hard to like have a clear understanding of what kind of risk you're taking. And early in the pandemic, one thing that I remember doing with my spouse is we sat down and we said, what's the annual risk of getting killed on the roads in Texas, the way we live, given how many miles we travel? And we couldn't do a great job of it. One of the things that's difficult about these decisions is that it's like really hard to have exactly the data you want. You really have to be an expert to amass the kind of statistical data you want. But we did a rough ballpark. It said, like, suppose that we drive in a way that's statistically average for Texas, which we know is not true because we live close enough to Rice that we don't drive highways to get to work. Didn't drive highways to get to work back when we went to work instead of sitting down at a special seat in the bedroom to go to work. But back in those days, we would go to work, but we didn't do exactly what everybody else did. On average, we weren't statistically uh, representative, but we still like estimated it. You can get Department of Transportation stats from the state government and see how many people die on the roads and how many miles are driven, so how many deaths per mile. And we could see like, what is the risk that we just accept as the everyday risk of getting killed driving, and we drive anyway. We could see what that risk was. Then we could say, all right, given what we currently know about the pandemic, what is the risk of dying from the pandemic if we get sick? And is it more or less than the risk that we already accept being out on the roads? And I don't even remember what the answer was at the time. I think it was less. I think it was less. It should be, given our demographic features. So we were like, okay, that's comforting. There's still a lot of things to worry about other than death. Like, I don't want to be terribly sick for 2 weeks. And honestly, when my son first started going to daycare, he got sick a lot, but I got really sick, like so debilitated that I was put on steroids to break the cycle of infection. Um, Not dexamethasone, but yeah, really sick. And that didn't give me a lot of good feelings about catching COVID. Because, thinking back to that time, I was thinking, maybe my basic demographic facts are masking some underlying weaknesses because I just really didn't cope with my son starting daycare. Every disease that he brought home, I got worse. Uh, okay, so I was like, well, we have some idea about the risks. We look at the risks. They're not so severe that we have to like panic. It's like, okay, you have to accept the risk of like, it would be like you just suddenly decided to drive twice as much. And you're like, gee, I'm on the roads a lot. That kind of makes me feel like I might be in an accident at some point where it's riskier than what I was doing before. And that accident might be mild or it might be severe. And we tried to think about it in those terms. Like that's the extra risk we're taking. And then we thought, well, but let's be a little thoughtful about this. Like, my partner didn't get that sick. I did get that sick during that first year of daycare. Maybe I should like be a little more worried. Like I'm driving, uh, you know, a car from the 1970s with a lap belt, those extra miles. Not the safest extra miles to add, in other words. Uh, and maybe I should be cautious about adding all those extra miles. In other words, taking on all that extra risk. Maybe I should do what I can. And that's just thinking selfishly, right? Just thinking about my own risk. When I just thought about it in those terms, it was really hard, is my upshot. It was really hard to think rationally, clearly, using evidence about what the change in risk was in my life and what to do about it. Um, and I have the advantage of being a university professor and being comfortable with math and having a partner who's also highly educated and also comfortable with math, and having a really good background set of views about what sources of information to trust and why on what topics. And it would be so much harder for like the average American to do that. I have a privileged position when it comes to like calculating stuff like that, solving those kinds of problems. My education suits me better for it than most people. So when you're asking like, other people being reckless and why are they doing it, part of it is that they can't work out for themselves how reckless they're being. They have to kind of go off of the guidelines that you use. And what are the guidelines that you use? Well, like people that you trust, people that you have faith in, are acting a certain way. So if the people that you trust and that you rely on are wearing masks and canceling events and saying, well, we're not going to be doing Thanksgiving this year except over, FaceTime, and well, it's too bad, but well, we'll get through it. If those are the people that you trust and that's what they're saying, you're going to say, okay, whatever the risk is, it's serious, and I should probably match more or less people like that. If the people that you trust, on the other hand, are not wearing masks and they're holding events and they're telling people, like there's risks, but there's risks to everything. And those are people that you trust. You can't just say, well, now it's time for me to recalculate whether or not I should trust those people. Like, on what basis would you make that calculation? These are the people you trust, and you can't crunch the numbers yourself. So you just have to say, well, people who seem okay seem like they're doing that, so I guess I can do that. Like that's how we make. That's how most people make most risk decisions. They just kind of look around, like, well, what's everybody else doing? Um, Sometimes this leads to really bad outcomes. One of the things I've noticed about driving in Houston compared to other cities I've driven in is that nobody pulls over for emergency vehicles until the very last second. Like when the fire engine is like right behind you and tailgating you, then you're like, oh, well, I suppose out of the goodness of my heart, I could pull over. Uh, it's not the level of emergency vehicle compliance that we see in other cities in the United States or Canada, in my experience. Uh, Part of what sustains that is when you're driving down the road and you're like, should I pull over? You're like, well, nobody else, including people that I see in my rear view, are way closer to the emergency vehicle are pulling over. So I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't pull over. Like, there's risks and rewards. If I pull over, maybe somebody won't even understand that I've pulled over to get out of the way of the emergency vehicle, and I'll get rear-ended. You it's not just natural. It's reasonable to think about this stuff, um, and it's also human nature. It's very hard to crunch the numbers every time. It's just natural to look around. And when we look around, we don't look at the people we think are idiots, we look at the people we trust. And if there are two radically different communities of trust and they're saying radically different things about what to do, you got to expect that it's perfectly reasonable for the people who don't trust the other half to just shake their heads at what they're doing and say reckless idiots or say cowards, you know. And only the people who can really sit down and do more to analyze the problem than that can be expected to do more. It's only just a handful of us. I mean, it's a lot of rice, but it's only a handful of us.
Yes. Well, thanks so much, Tim. We're almost out of time, and so I want to be mindful of your time and the fact that some folks have to go to class. So we really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today, and even the way that you ended, walking through. I feel like you perfectly captured especially the particular political moment that we're in, where half of the population is looking at the other half and vice versa, saying, oh, you guys are such idiots, right? I mean, that's the moment that we're in. So that seems especially timely. I want to thank everyone who attended today. I just want to say one last thing. As a reminder, there's an event tomorrow sponsored by the School of Humanities that's called After RBG, which is going to talk about what's next now that we've had the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and there will be two law professors who are going to talk about that tomorrow afternoon at 4. If you're interested, you can go to the Humanities webpage and see more information. And then next semester, we're going to continue these conversations. And so please be on the lookout for more emails about conversations, Humanities Now conversations in the spring. So thanks everybody for coming by. I appreciate it. Have a good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Schroeder.